Passiamo ora, la seduta è ripresa, ad una sessione che ha per oggetto un tema che riguarda molto da vicino i nostri lavori: lo stato dei negoziati in vista della 26ª conferenza delle parti sul clima, che avrà luogo, come sapete, a Glasgow fra il 1° e il 12 novembre prossimi. Il primo dei keynote speaker di questa sessione è il ministro italiano per la transizione ecologica, Roberto CINGOLANI, che invito ad intervenire. Grazie Ministro.
So thank you, Mr. President. I have a, sorry? Okay, thank you, Mr. President. I will use this about 10 minutes to tell you what's going on through the pipeline that started with the G20 meeting in Naples at the end of July, through the recent, in the last week, the recent Youth for Climate event that was joined to the Pre-Cop event, also in Milan, and just before yesterday in Luxembourg, the ministerial meeting of the European environmental transition ministers of the European Union. There was quite an evolution because in Naples, the main message at a given point was that all countries in the G20 shared the point that we should have agreed unanimously to the Paris Agreement target, and including China, including India. So the point was we have to be below 2 degrees by the second part of the century. However, a few weeks ago we got the IPCC report that clearly stated that there was actually a delay in our agenda, and as you know, the temperature was supposed to increase by 2.73 degrees. So this has generated a sort of urgency. The main wording during last week in Milan at the Pre-COP and Youth for Climate events was ambition plus acceleration. That has emerged today in the various interventions that you gave. So let's see which are the 5 points that we are forwarding to the COP26 as a result of the work done in the Pre-COP. The first one, that definitely we have to keep the 1.5 degrees concept alive. That is an acceleration, as you heard before. It was not anonymously accepted a few months ago, and now even the biggest countries having, of course, a much bigger problem in changing their strategy, they have admitted that we have to be well below 2 degrees. So there's the hope that we can share the ambitious target of 1.5 degrees at the COP26. Just want to give you the numbers that was mentioned before during the interventions of the various parliamentarians. You are obviously aware of the fact that the G20 organization represents approximately 4.8 billion people around the world, producing 80% of the greenhouse gas. But the COP26 actually embodies more than 190 countries, so it embodies another 3 billion people that hardly produce 20% of greenhouse gas. 1 billion of that, approximately 1 billion, having no access to electricity, and most of them having no clean fuel for cooking. That means that even the definition of ecological transition changed, depending on whether you're in Finland, in Italy, or wherever in the United States, or in other most vulnerable countries. So this is something that has become very clear and has become commonly accepted. We can't separate the strategy for the climate change fight by the strategy for the reduction of the global inequality. If we don't treat the two things together, we will fail anyway. The second expectation for the COP26 has to do with carbon pricing. So how we balance the market, because there are countries producing duties by using technology and manufacturing that is carbon intensive. How do we phase out unabated coal power sources, and in general, how do we phase out coal-based manufacturing? We all agree that this has to be done. Countries are much faster, targeting at 2025. Other countries are targeting much longer, 2030, 2035. And of course, if a large country reaches the peak 5 years after the others, we might have a global imbalancement at a given point that essentially will will not allow everybody to match the Paris Agreement target, the 55% decarbonization. Another issue for the COP26 is subsidizing coal technologies. This has to be reduced, but of course countries have different strategies. There's no consensus, global consensus. We all know that we have to do it, but the timing is again different, as well as how do we accomplish the transition by ensuring the needed technological neutrality. Energy production in different countries, the strategy of energy production in different countries is different, and of course technology neutrality is something that we have to accomplish, but we don't have a unified recipe. Those are points that will be discussed at the COP26. The third pillar of the discussion has to do with adaptation, loss, and damage. And particularly, adaptation is something we've been discussing a lot, primarily because we have to operationalize, so making it operative, the Santiago network for loss and damage. There are countries in which catastrophic events, extreme events, can lead to dramatic change, to enormous problems, and there the intervention has to be instantaneous, which is not the case in richer countries, for instance. So the Santiago network has to be made effective, quick, operational. The fourth pillar of the discussion has to do with rules, governance, accounting capability, and more in general, Article 6. So the nationally determined contribution to the transition has to be based on a very transparent metric. We can't give numbers that are not based on a unified and well-established metric with the right degree of transparency. Otherwise, we will fail in having a global assessment of what's going on over the next year. Europe is, for instance, targeting the European Transparency Framework, but of course, this is not only Europe. Europe produces only 9% of the greenhouse gas. So this has to be global, also to protect weaker countries. We need a common reporting table for the greenhouse gas. This should be the final result. This is something we have to address and decide precisely at the COP26. Once again, there was quite a general consensus around those concepts during our discussion. I can guarantee at the G20 in Naples, at the Pre-Cop in Milan, at the Youth for Climate in Milan, and before yesterday at the ministerial meeting of Europe, there was general consensus. The point is, how do we make those things real? So it's a matter of algorithms, of technicalities, but I have the feeling that everybody agrees, and that's very important. Finally, and this is really least but not last, finance. In Paris 2015, we promised, the rich countries have promised, to raise 100 billion per year to support vulnerable countries and to reduce inequalities. So far, we hardly reached the 60 billion. And of course, the COVID period didn't help. Even the best economies had quite a recoil. So this year, and this is exactly what happened 2 days ago in Luxembourg, the European ministers will all agreed about the fact that we do have to accomplish the 100 billion. United States, everybody agrees, okay? There's no point of discussion. But we all know that 100 billion is not enough. Because the 3 billion people we're talking, they are possibly spread over hundreds of countries or so, and of course 100 billion is nothing. So there is a clear awareness about the fact that those 100 billion, they act like a spark. They should leverage at least 1 trillion. So the new wording that came out in the last weeks is that we have to make a trillion range effort to reduce inequality. Trillion is, as you know, 1,000 billions. So the 100 public billions should rise at least 1,000 private billions. And this is a new concept of public-private partnership through investment banks, private investors, philanthropy, and the public has the responsibility to drain those money, to push this fundraising, and to reduce inequalities as soon as possible. So the last point is that we need to rethink global financial architectures. This is really necessary now to help better, to help more effectively, and to make all our promises real. That means, again, public-private partnership, treating properly indebted countries, so how do we manage with the big debts of some countries, and finally, fiscal frame, that especially in the field of climate actions, it's very important. It has to be possibly redesigned. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is the outcome of the last few months that were very effective. I had the honor to be the president of the G20 Environment and Energy in Naples. I did see quite an advancement, but after the IPCC report, I saw a further ambition and a further acceleration to be established at the Pre-Cop in Milan 1 week ago, and before yesterday in Luxembourg. At least the European position was very clear. We should make all those things real, and this will need a lot of work, but I think the preconditions are very promising for the Pre-Cop, and this is where we are. Thank you for your attention.
Invito ora ad intervenire il consigliere speciale del segretario generale delle Nazioni Unite per l'azione climatica e sottosegretario generale per il team di supporto sull'azione climatica, Selwin HART. Questo intervento avrà luogo da remoto. Prego.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning from New York, and good evening to you in Italy. It's always a pleasure to see Minister CINGOLANI. I thank him for his outstanding leadership as host of the presidency of the G20, as well as the skillful job that he did at the Pre-Cop in guiding the negotiations. Now, we're just over 3 weeks away from COP26, and this is the most important climate conference since Paris. It really must be a decisive conference for humanity and for the planet. And the science tells us, as the distinguished minister just said, that we have an ever-narrowing window of opportunity to avert the worst impacts of the climate crisis. And COP26 must be that moment when the world accelerates progress at scale and pace to close the gaps that we have on mitigation, finance, and on adaptation. But of course, COP26 is not happening in isolation. It is happening in the context of a global pandemic. It is happening in the context of an uneven global recovery. It is happening in the context of vaccine inequity. It is happening in the context of a looming fiscal crisis, rising debt levels in many parts of the developing world. And unfortunately, these issues have resulted in a breakdown in trust between the developed and the developing world. And it was good to see last week at the pre-COP session that I attended, how the conversations were frank, how they were open, and how the distinguished minister was able to help bridge some of this trust deficit that is missing between the developed and the developing world. We're also seeing devastating and unprecedented climate impacts. And we're seeing these impacts on every continent, in every region, and in every country. Just last year alone, 30 million persons were displaced from climate-related disasters. And this is 3 times more than the persons which were displaced or who were displaced from war and violence. Now, science is also telling us that these impacts will increase in frequency and severity, and they will be felt worst in nations and in communities and by people in vulnerable and in fragile situations. So the good news is that we know what needs to be done. The world has the tools, both financial and technological, to do the job, and that we have a framework, a multilateral framework to mobilize action, namely the Paris Agreement. So the Secretary General has identified three priorities as we head towards COP26, which will help us to provide the world with a credible narrative that we are on track to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. First is keeping 1.5 alive. The 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement must be met. The reality is that we're way off target, as the minister indicated. The current national commitments, or NDCs, nationally determined contributions, that have been presented place the world on a pathway of 2.7 degrees Celsius of warming. This is unacceptable. We need all G20 nations, as the minister indicated, G20 nations account for 80% of global emissions. We need all G20 nations ahead of Glasgow to submit new and more ambitious NDCs. Some have resubmitted their Paris NDCs, their 2015 national climate plans, which are grossly insufficient. So we need your help to reach out to as many of these countries as possible to get them to submit as more ambitious nationally determined contributions. Glasgow must also signal the end of coal. During the high-level week of the General Assembly, the president of China indicated that China will end international finance of coal. This places China in the company of Japan and Korea, who announced earlier this year that they will end international coal financing to the developing world. This is an extremely valuable and useful step, but we need more commitment, and we need firmer commitments from countries on ambitious phase-out dates for their domestic coal consumption. This is one of the key deliverables that must be delivered at Glasgow. At Glasgow, we also need a roadmap on how this mitigation gap between the national commitments that countries have put on the table, as well as the gap between the NDCs and the 1.5-degree goal, how that gap will be closed in a very credible way. The Paris Agreement states in its Article 4 that countries don't need to submit an NDC or nationally determined contribution every 5 years, but can submit a national climate plan or an NDC at any time. A number of countries, for example, over the course of the last 2 days, Turkey and the United Arab Emirates have made new net zero by mid-century commitments. Countries should be encouraged to submit NDCs after Glasgow if they don't have enough time to finalize a new and more ambitious NDCs. So we're hoping that we can have a credible package that shows the world that the 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement remains within reach. And we need your help and support in order to achieve this. The second priority of the Secretary General is on finance. The $100 billion commitment that was made since 2019, it's also a symbol of trust in the multilateral climate process. And it's a mere down payment on the trillions, as the minister so eloquently said, that will be needed to support adaptation and resilience in the developing world. According to the OECD, we are about $20 billion short of this $100 billion commitment. And no effort should be spared in terms of encouraging countries, including Italy. We will be pushing you as well to increase your public climate finance commitment so that, again, we can tell a credible story that the gap between under 100 billion is closing and that it will be delivered to the developing world. And finally, on adaptation and resilience, it is unfortunately, and this is the third priority of the Secretary General, we have to be very honest with ourselves. Adaptation remains the neglected half of the climate equation. After close to 3 decades of multilateral negotiations on climate, support for adaptation and resilience stands at a mere 25% of total climate finance support. In the Paris Agreement, a promise was made to the developing world that support for mitigation and adaptation would be balanced given the urgency of the climate crisis and the urgency of climate impacts, especially in the vulnerable countries, like the least developed countries and small island developing states. At the UN, we estimate that the adaptation costs facing the developing world currently stand at about $70 billion a year, and that this would quadruple to about $300 billion a year by 2030. So I cannot stress how urgent it is to significantly scale up adaptation finance to vulnerable developing countries. And this is why the Secretary General has been calling on donors and the MDBs to allocate at least 50% of their public climate finance support towards adaptation and resilience needs in the developing world. Failure to deliver on adaptation and resilience means loss of lives and livelihoods in the developing world. It means growing instability in countries in already fragile situations. So the world has a moral obligation for prioritizing adaptation support to the most vulnerable countries. Denmark, Sweden, and the Netherlands have pledged to provide at least 50% of their climate support towards adaptation and resilience. And we hope that other countries, including Italy and the EU, will also send this really positive signal to the developing world. We also need Italy and the European Union to use their voice on the boards of the multilateral development banks to press these institutions to be more ambitious on climate change. It is concerning that after 10 years, in excess of a decade of having climate targets, the MDBs still mobilize less than $1 of private finance for every dollar of MDB finance. Less than $1 of private finance. They need to do a much better job in mobilizing private finance because we need private finance at scale. So we hope that Italy will use its voice as a shareholder on the MDBs to press for this. So finally, we believe, and the Secretary General believes, that success remains within reach. We will need Italy and the European Union, who've traditionally played important bridge building roles between developed and developing countries, to undertake this as we head towards Glasgow. It means not only engaging with the G20 nations, but also with the small island developing states, countries in Africa, the least developed countries, countries in the Latin American and Caribbean region. As the minister indicated, this is a multilateral process with over 190 countries who have many different interests. So we look forward to success in Glasgow. We also look to success at the upcoming G20 Leaders Summit that the Secretary General will be participating in. And we continue to look forward to the outstanding leadership of Italy as we use the COP26 in Glasgow as this important moment where the world accelerates progress to close the gaps on mitigation, on finance, and on adaptation. I thank you so much, Mr. President.
Grazie, apriamo ora il dibattito. Ricordo che il tempo a disposizione per gli interventi è di 2 minuti. Ha chiesto di intervenire Angelo Farrugia, Speaker della Camera dei Rappresentanti di Malta. Prego.
Grazie, Presidente. Climate change is the most enduring threat to our futures. And I'm delighted to hear Minister Roberto CINGOLANI and also the Speaker of Special Advisor of the United Nations. Of course, Malta, as a small island state, has various legally binding targets to meet by 2020 and 2030 as a new member state and party to the multilateral legal instruments combating climate change like the Paris Agreement. During the strenuous 2020 year, Malta has updated the Climate Change Act by limiting anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gas, sinks and of course reservoirs. This year, Malta has embarked on an ambitious 30-year journey towards total decarbonization, which involves a low-carbon development strategy and a plan to have cleaner vehicles on our roads. I recall the important CPA, that is the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association Small Branches Climate Change Workshop, which I conducted in Nairobi, Kenya, with collaboration with UNEP, where parliamentarians, the small jurisdictions, discussed the shared challenges associated with climate change. And we came out with the Toolkit for Parliamentarians. The Toolkit was designed in collaboration with and for use by national governments and also international organizations. We have a critical role to identify the most cost-effective measures to reduce emissions across the sectors involving energy, buildings, transport, industry, waste, agriculture and water. This multifaceted approach, championed by small states, provides, Mr. Chairman, a fresh and a renewed method of combating climate change tailored to small states. Malta, a small state in the Mediterranean, certainly is leading by example. Thank you very much.
Grazie. Ha chiesto di intervenire Bernard Dillà, vicepresidente dell'Assemblea nazionale della Repubblica Centroafricana. Prego. È presente Bernard Dillà? Passiamo avanti. Chiesto di intervenire Alice Mary Higgins, componente del Senato irlandese. Prego. Mi scusi? Prego. Microfono, per favore.
Colleagues, no more evasions or delays. We know we must deliver in COP26. Finalisation of the Paris rulebook with transparency, NDCs that reflect common but differentiated responsibilities, early action on methane to stay within 1.5 degrees, and action to end the abuse of emissions trading and offsets to stew accountancy. On funding, delivering the 100 billion promised and owed under both Paris and the SDGs, as well as adaptation funding and payment for loss and damage. Coherence, so the policy space needed by countries to act on climate is not undermined by old debts and old trade rules. ISDS compensation cannot be allowed to delay the exit from fossil fuels, and profits from intellectual property cannot be allowed to delay the rollout of urgent global solutions and technology transfer, including public-public partnerships. We cannot afford business as usual or a greenwash. The new paths we need require that economics fits inside our environmental and planetary boundaries including the new digital industries, which must also fit within these boundaries in their energy usage. Human rights and gender equality must be core in COP26, including the new right to a healthy environment agreed just today at the UN Human Rights Council. Crucially, the Action for Climate Justice programme under Article 6 must be strengthened, listening to and led by Indigenous peoples and youth who understand the links between climate and biodiversity, between solidarity and survival. As public representatives of the peoples across this beautiful, fragile planet, the only one with life, we have a responsibility now to be brave and to act. Thank you.
Grazie. Ha chiesto di intervenire Ankurao Kalla, primo vicepresidente dell'Assemblea nazionale del Niger. Prego. Ankurao Kalla. Passiamo avanti. Si provi a schiacciare il tasto giallo. Perfetto, grazie.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. La délégation du Niger se félicite de prendre part à ce débat et se propose d'intervenir sur deux sujets d'importance majeure du présent débat sur la lutte contre les effets néfastes du changement climatique. En premier lieu, l'initiative de la Grande Muraille verte en Afrique. Ce projet concerne l'ensemble des pays de la bande sahélo-sahélienne qui nous intéresse au plus haut point, d'une part, parce que sa mise en œuvre contribue à reverdir le désert et à restaurer l'environnement. Et d'autre part, il donnera une opportunité d'emploi à des milliers de jeunes chômeurs, toute chose qui boostera les économies après deux années de marasme dues à la pandémie du Covid. En deuxième lieu, la multiplication des catastrophes constatées les 10 dernières années n'épargne pas les pays de la bande sahélienne. Et malheureusement, la prise en charge de ce phénomène par la communauté internationale n'est pas à la hauteur de nos attentes. La COP26 doit nécessairement prendre en compte les inquiétudes des victimes de ces catastrophes dans la programmation des activités. Quant à nous, nous allons veiller, quant à nous parlementaires, notre rôle à nous est de veiller à initier des lois dans ce cadre, veiller à l'action du gouvernement et animer et sensibiliser les populations pour une prise en conscience de ce changement climatique. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Grazie. Ha chiesto di intervenire Raúl Bolaños Cachoque, presidente della Commissione Ambiente del Senato messicano. Spero di star pronunciando bene i vostri nomi.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I will deliver my message in my national language. Buenas tardes a todos los parlamentarios presentes. A nombre de la delegación mexicana que me honro en representar, quiero externar nuestra preocupación ante el estado que guardan las negociaciones de la próxima COP26 a celebrarse en Glasgow. Sin duda, la pandemia por COVID-19 ha sido un reto para todos los países, pero es innegable que para los países más pobres, para los países emergentes y los países del sur global, hemos tenido que enfrentar dificultades mayores como son el acceso a las vacunas, el financiamiento económico y la seguridad alimentaria. Durante décadas nos reunimos cada año para dialogar y buscar soluciones y crear compromisos para evitar el aumento de la temperatura global. Hoy atestiguamos que no hemos avanzado, no hemos cumplido con los compromisos adquiridos incluso desde la COP15 y COP16. Los invito a tomar en cuenta que el cambio climático exacerba las inequidades e injusticias presentes en nuestra sociedad. Los países que contribuimos con menor porcentaje de emisiones a nivel global somos de los países más vulnerables a los impactos del cambio climático. Esto no implica que los países del sur global no estemos comprometidos también con la reducción de emisiones y con la adaptación al cambio climático. Sin embargo, es necesario recordar a la comunidad internacional que ONU Medio Ambiente calcula que los costos de adaptación están en el rango de 140 y 300 mil millones para el 2030 y entre 280 y 500 mil millones de dólares anuales para el 2050. México externa su compromiso a continuar con el mejoramiento de sus políticas públicas para cumplir con los compromisos nacionales e internacionales en materia de cambio climático. Seguimos involucrados en el trabajo arduo con la comunidad internacional, pero también hemos de continuar con el exhorto a los países desarrollados para que cumplan con sus metas. Se lo debemos a las niñas y a los niños, a la juventud, se lo debemos a nuestro planeta y a todas las generaciones por venir. Muchas gracias.
Grazie. Ha chiesto di intervenire Marcos Pereira, membro della Camera dei Deputati del Brasile. Prego.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Prego la mascherina.
Sim, sorry. I will speak in Portuguese. Ladies and gentlemen, a cooperação interamericana, interparlamentar, é indispensável para o êxito de ações e iniciativas em face de desafios que são comuns ao conjunto da comunidade internacional. A sustentabilidade é uma pauta importante na Câmara dos Deputados do Brasil. Apoiamos os esforços globais para o clima e os compromissos assumidos pelo país no âmbito da Convenção Quadro das Nações Unidas sobre a mudança do clima e do Acordo de Paris. São diversas as medidas concluídas ou em andamento no Parlamento sobre o tema, com impacto positivo sobre as contribuições nacionalmente determinadas brasileiras. Aprovamos a Política Nacional de Pagamento por Serviços Ambientais, que estabelece um conjunto de incentivos à preservação dos biomas no Brasil. Em agosto, a Câmara aprovou o Marco Legal da Geração Distribuída de Energia, com medidas abrangentes para fomentar a geração de energia limpa. Encontra-se em discussão avançada a conformação de um mercado de carbono no país. Está pronta para a pauta do plenário a ratificação da emenda de Kigali ao Protocolo de Montreal, que versa sobre a redução do uso de hidrofluorocarbonos, substâncias com elevado impacto sobre o sistema climático global. No tema dos incêndios florestais, foi criada a Comissão Parlamentar para monitorar as queimadas em biomas brasileiros e se acha pronto para a pauta em plenário a Política Nacional de Manejo Integrado do Fogo. Para concluir, reafirmo que a Câmara dos Deputados do Brasil está atenta ao tema, vigilante, propositiva e aberta ao diálogo e à cooperação internacional. Esperamos, em Glasgow, traga avanços decisivos para a nossa ação coletiva, de modo que todos os países, conforme suas responsabilidades e seus recursos, deem uma contribuição com a urgência e a dimensão requerida pela situação. Muito obrigado.
La ringrazio. Ha chiesto di intervenire Nauren Farouk Ibrahim, membro dell'Assemblea Nazionale del Pakistan. Prego.
Thank you. Strong interparliamentary cooperation is crucial for finding international solutions that ensure all countries are able to meet their unavoidable challenges. Accounting for the diversity of our Parliament's mandates and functions, we call upon all parliamentarians to ensure that their country's national climate commitments and international obligations are transparently scrutinized, widely debated, and most importantly, honored. Developing countries do not have the capacity or resources to fight climate change. But still, their share in carbon and greenhouse emissions is very low. All the reasons why developed countries should support developing countries. Funds would be required to hire consultants to prepare such detailed documents. Pakistan strongly supports the goal of reaching net zero by 2050. Another risk to climate ambition is transitional emissions, which so far have not been accounted for in international negotiations, particularly those of the aviation and shipping industries, as well as crop burning. Climate change also poses a significant threat to global food security. Any reduction in biodiversity combined with changing weather patterns reduces crop yields and results in food shortage. We call for a global commitment to its principles of assisting the transformation of latest scientific farming methods to Pakistan as a key to climate actions. Thank you.
Grazie. Ha chiesto di intervenire Carula Cafantari, componente del Parlamento ellenico. Prego.
Thank you.
La mascherina, per favore? Sì. Posso chiedere di mettere la mascherina e cambiare microfono? Se può cambiare postazione, perché c'era un'interferenza nel microfono.
Thank you, Mr. President. The last issue of IPCC report describes accurately the present situation of global climate change. It is stressed out that all necessary means must be taken urgently to limit the global warming. On the other hand, FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization, report the situation on the food system. 40% of the world population have not the means to afford healthy and nutritious food, a situation worsened by the impacts of climate change. The last report issued with co-working of United Nations states that biodiversity is deteriorating worldwide, and this decline is projected to worsen. All these reports confirm that the world is under a triple threat: climate change, food insecurity, loss of biodiversity. The answer to all this is simple: the transition to new economies with radical change of development models, including change of consumer habits, sustainable energy production and agricultural methods, environmental protections, and restoring ecosystems. To achieve our climate goals, governments, business, civil society need to work together to manage the increasing impacts of climate change on our lives. Thank you.
Grazie. Ha chiesto di intervenire Erzsébet Schmuck, Presidente della Commissione per lo Sviluppo Sostenibile dell'Assemblea Nazionale ungherese. Prego.
Thank you very much. Dear Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for the excellent presentations enlightening the main points of climate emergency, the necessity of urgent global and national commitments, all in light of climate science. According to the sixth assessment report of IPCC addressing the most up-to-date physical understanding of the climate system and climate change, there is a serious lessons to be learned. No action is not an option. Human-induced climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe. As for me, it is not a question that we should secure global net zero greenhouse gas emission by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. The only question is how to do it. Until now, we have had a lot of discussions, have made papers about the necessity of strengthening national and sectoral contributions, targets, and tools. But we have to recognize that it is not enough. It is already obvious that without strict commitments of individual countries and without ambitious indices, we will not be able to restrain climate change. Last year, the Hungarian parliament accepted the climate law, and we have climate strategy as well. But I have to say that we are far from We are far away from those steps that are introduced in IPPC reports. Fortunately, due to the public awareness-raising campaigns, more and more people lift up their voice for efficiency measures, for actions, mitigating emission and helping adoption. I am sure that we have to fulfill their expectations. The Hungarian IPU group fully supports the draft outcome document of the parliamentary meeting. Thank you very much for the attention.
Grazie. Chiesto di intervenire Konstantin Kosachev, Vice Speaker del Consiglio della Federazione Russa. Prego, grazie.
Dear Mr. President, dear colleagues, Russia has successfully fulfilled its obligations under the Kyoto Protocol and adopted the Paris Agreement. Last November, we set national targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. By 2030, their level should be no more than 70% of the 1990 level. 2, our country considers the Paris Agreement to be a reliable international legal framework for a long-term climate settlement. We therefore welcome the agreement on most of the rules for implementing the Paris Agreement. As a result, the agreement has become a full-fledged working document. 3, unfortunately, during the 25th session of the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Madrid, participants did not agree on common approaches to the implementation of market and non-market mechanism of the Paris Agreement. We look forward for completing this work during the 26th Conference of the Parties in Glasgow. 4, in general, we positively assess the results of the 52nd session of the subsidiary bodies of the UN Framework Convention, held online in June this year. This event provides a good basis for bringing the positions of the participating states closer together. 5, Russia attaches great importance to the package of solutions for the financial and technological sector. Our country does not have legal obligations under the UN Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement to provide financial assistance to developing countries, but we provide donor assistance on a voluntary basis. And finally, we hope that before the Glasgow conference, we will be able to bring the positions of the parties on the climate agenda closer together. Thank you. Perfect timing.
E la ringrazio per questo. Ha chiesto di intervenire Katia Regina De Abreu, Presidente della Commissione Affari Esteri e Difesa del Senato Federale del Brasile. Prego.
Cumprimento ao senhor Roberto FICO, presidente da Câmara dos Deputados. Muito obrigada por estarmos aqui hoje, pela sua organização. Parabéns. Um dos desafios atuais da comunidade internacional é a implementação das NDCs anunciadas recentemente. O Brasil tem vantagens comparativas e pode ser ambicioso em seus compromissos de reduzir em 43% suas emissões e zerar o desmatamento ilegal até 2030. Somos hoje um dos países com maior capacidade para cumprir os compromissos assumidos no âmbito do Acordo de Paris. O Legislativo e o Executivo do Brasil estão empenhados em demonstrá-lo na COP26 em Glasgow. O país é líder mundial em termos de energia limpa, 46% de toda a geração de energia e 85% de toda a eletricidade são oriundas de fontes renováveis, o que nos isenta de ônus da mudança da matriz verde, talvez o maior desafio a ser enfrentado por outros países. Somos detentores de técnicas de agricultura de baixo carbono, desenvolvidas nas últimas décadas para a produção agrícola. A agricultura sustentável de base científica já inibiu o desmatamento de 103 milhões de hectares nos últimos 30 anos, o que corresponde a 3 vezes o território da Itália. Assim, logramos ser o maior exportador de alimentos do mundo, preservando 66% da totalidade dos nossos biomas. Somente na Amazônia, preservamos 80% dos nossos biomas. Viemos aqui, senhor presidente, não para ser ovacionados, mas para dizer ao mundo que nós não apoiamos o ataque ilegal à Amazônia, que nós temos compromisso com a Amazônia, com o Brasil e com o mundo, em nome dos parlamentares do Senado Federal brasileiro. Obrigada.
Grazie. Ha chiesto di intervenire John McGowan, membro del Senato irlandese. Prego.
Is this on? Thank you, Chairperson. Just on behalf of the Irish delegation, I'd just like to say it's a real pleasure to be here as a younger member of Parliament, to see so many other parliamentarians here that are so committed to climate action, and the determination in this room today is really quite inspiring. And these negotiations are so important for our future. It's our last chance, indeed our very last chance to get it correct. It should be framed through opportunity, it should be framed through positivity, and it should be framed through positive change in our societies, rather than enacting a burden on society. I'm very heartened to hear the determination of the speakers today, and in particular, one of the previous speakers, Marie Neera, was so inspiring as she got up here and spoke about such the stark reality that it will take $5 trillion in health spending, global health spending around the world, if we do not enact our climate policies. And finally, it's a great honour for me to be here alongside the Irish delegation. We may be a very small country, but in recent weeks we have just passed some of the most progressive and some of the most positive and some of the most radical climate action legislation in the world. And we, as a small country on the western edge of Europe, are so prepared and so determined to play our role in this global fight against climate action. And a lot of times it's been said back to us in our Parliament, well, what's the point of Ireland doing this? What's the point of Ireland as a small country introducing all these rules and regulations when you have bigger polluters around the world? Well, we want to be the leading country for small countries in this planet about what we need to do with climate action. And I have no doubt that other countries, particularly in the European Union, over the next couple of years will look towards Ireland, will look towards that climate legislation, that climate action legislation, and hopefully will take a lot of positives from it and introduce it in their own respective democracies. Thank you.
La ringrazio. Chiesto di intervenire Faisal Javed, membro della Commissione Ambiente del Senato del Pakistan. Prego. Per favore la mascherina.
Ok.
Grazie.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Pakistan's case study to success showing great commitment and implementation under the leadership of Prime Minister Imran Khan. Pakistan became the first country in the world to meet the International Bond Challenge, and challenge was to restore around 350,000 hectares of land into forest. Pakistan restored over 600,000 hectares of land into forests, planted over 1 billion trees in KP province, and now we have made a commitment of planting 10 billion trees across Pakistan. And out of 10 billion trees, over 1 billion trees have already been planted. Pakistan's commitment towards climate change is fighting climate change is commendable. We achieved United Nations Climate Action Goal, SDG 13, that too a decade before the deadline. So Pakistan has done a lot. Major initiatives that we took was the 10 billion tree project, Clean and Green Pakistan, and also Protected Areas Initiative and electrification of transport. Ecosystem Restoration Fund has also been launched in Pakistan. What Pakistan has achieved, despite resource constraints, is aspirational for many countries. Pakistan contributes less than 1% of the global greenhouse emissions, but yet we are constantly among top 10 most impacted countries by climate change. Pakistan shows the way on climate change as the World Bank new engagements in Pakistan in financial year 2021 hit the highest climate co-benefits in the world in terms of absolute value, and highest in South Asia as a percentage of new commitments. Developing countries, of course, need a lot of support from the developed countries, and we do hope as we walk in COP26, we go with great negotiations. Thank you.
Grazie. Chiedo se i nostri relatori intendano replicare. Prego, Ministro.
So, Mr. President, thank you for this opportunity. I'll take just 30 seconds, and I think it was clear that there is a general consensus about what we have to do, but of course there are totally different local circumstances, and this appeared very clear after the different contributions. Some of the countries were pointing out about the impact of COVID, about the impact of extreme weather events connected to the climate change. Others were talking about energy poverty. Others were talking about nutrition and food. So clearly the agenda is very complicated. It's a multidimensional problem. We know it. There's no single solution. And if this were easy, we would have done it already. So we are perfectly aware of the fact that we have to work hard. But I should take the good part. The good part is that everybody agrees about the fact there is urgency, and we're all moving in the same direction. Everybody according to its possibilities, the local possibilities and local circumstances. I think this is a very good point for the COP26. We know that this is a global effort, and I see a lot of goodwill to accomplish something in the forthcoming COP26 event. Thank you, Mr. President.
Grazie Ministro. Ha chiesto di replicare anche Selwin HART come relatore, prego.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. And it's really inspiring to hear this consensus from voices representing different countries and different interests and different circumstances. We hope that this spirit of consensus and cooperation and collaboration really filters down to your delegations in Glasgow. I also heard, as the minister indicated, that consensus around the need for an urgent and ambitious response to the climate crisis. All of you stressed this. All of you also stressed that the response to the climate crisis must address the ongoing challenges that many of you face as it relates to responding to the COVID-19 crisis. I also heard emerging consensus around the need for balanced deliverables and outcomes in Glasgow and beyond that keep the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement within reach. That also leads to significantly scaled up climate finance, including delivering on the 100 billion as a floor, but also recognizing, as many of you said, that it will take the trillions of dollars mobilized to address this crisis. And finally, many of the countries that spoke are on the front lines of the climate crisis. And it was inspiring to hear how issues related to adaptation and resilience are being prioritized. My only request to you, with 3 weeks left towards Glasgow, is that you transmit these messages to your national delegations who will be traveling to the climate talks. Many of you spoke about finalizing the rule book at Paris. They're highly technical negotiations, but it needs political will, political impetus from ministers and negotiators to find solutions. So please, we need your voices at home. Really transmit the really inspiring messages around action and urgency and ambition to your national delegations as they head towards Glasgow. It's been a pleasure participating in this event, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Ringrazio tutti gli intervenuti. Si è conclusa la seconda sessione dei nostri lavori. Grazie. E adesso però passiamo alle testimonianze e come sapete dal 28 al 30 settembre scorsi si è svolta a Milano l'assemblea della Youth for Climate Driving Ambition, che ha visto circa 400 giovani di tutto il mondo riunirsi per esprimere proposte ed indirizzi in vista della pre-COP di Milano e della COP di Glasgow. Ci è sembrato giusto invitare 2 di questi giovani anche alla nostra riunione per conoscere della loro viva voce il contenuto delle loro proposte, che sono di grandissimo interesse per i nostri lavori. Invito ad intervenire Daniele Guadagnolo. Prego.
Ringrazio il Presidente della Camera, Roberto FICO, e anche il Presidente del Senato della Repubblica Italiana, Maria Elisabetta Alberti Casellati, per averci dato l'opportunità di essere qui oggi a presentare i risultati di Youth for Climate e fare in modo che la nostra voce, ovvero quella dei giovani, venga ancora una volta ascoltata. Le priorità assolute emerse dal confronto tra 400 ragazzi provenienti da ogni parte del mondo sono riassunte molto brevemente in 4 punti. Punto numero 1. Emissioni zero entro il 2030, attuando una transizione equa e giusta, anche e soprattutto dal punto di vista lavorativo, e che dia priorità all'efficienza energetica, così come alle energie più rinnovabili e alle soluzioni basate sulla natura. Come parte di questo punto, ovviamente, c'è anche la richiesta di politiche di adattamento e di resilienza, non solo in materia di cambiamento climatico, ma anche in materia di sostenibilità. Il punto numero 2 riguarda introdurre nelle scuole una materia di insegnamento relativa all'ambiente ed al fenomeno del cambiamento climatico, in modo tale che i bambini ed i ragazzi non debbano cercarsi le informazioni talvolta fuorvianti ed imprecise solamente online. Il punto numero 3 invece riguarda il coinvolgimento dei giovani all'interno dei processi decisionali a livello multilaterale, nazionale e locale. Questo ovviamente con il supporto degli Stati membri nei confronti dei giovani per poter ottimizzare l'azione contro il riscaldamento globale. Il punto numero 4 invece riguarda il fare in modo che la transizione energetica sia inclusiva e diversificata, ovvero che tenga in considerazione gli attori non istituzionali e le minoranze. Questa è un'urgenza che più volte è stata sottolineata, ovvero riguarda la creazione dei flussi finanziari più trasparenti e anche più accessibili, in modo tale che siano supportati da leggi in materia di emissioni, così da assicurare uguali opportunità ed includendo anche le comunità più vulnerabili.
Grazie, invito ad intervenire Federica Gasbarro, prego.
Ringrazio anch'io il Presidente della Camera Roberto Fico, il Presidente del Senato della Repubblica Italiana Maria Elisabetta Alberti Casellati e tutti i presenti. L'esperienza di Milano, oltre a farci sentire parte del processo, ci ha dato la possibilità di confrontarci e guardare negli occhi i ragazzi che stanno sperimentando sulla loro pelle gli effetti devastanti dei cambiamenti climatici. In quello sguardo, quello di un ragazzo di nome Max, c'erano quelli di 13 milioni di persone che in Madagascar soffrono di insicurezza alimentare. 28.000 di queste versano in situazioni di carestia. Gli occhi di Valerie, invece, facevano intravedere i volti dell'80% di popolazione che in Perù non ha accesso all'elettricità. E potrei continuare con molte altre storie simili. Quando parliamo di crisi climatica, di emissioni zero entro il 2030, o ci danno dei catastrofisti o ci guardano con tenerezza. Ma la verità è che secondo la scienza, quelle persone che oggi percepiamo tanto lontane saremo noi, siamo noi, saranno i nostri figli. E quindi mi chiedo, vogliamo davvero dire loro di essere rimasti a guardare? Abbiamo bisogno di iniziare a vederci come qualcosa di unito alla natura, non qualcosa di separato da essa, perché fino a quel momento continueremo a devastarla. Parlando con uno scienziato dell'IPCC mi ha detto che è chiaro, il 1,5 gradi verrà senz'altro superato, ma mi ha anche dato la conferma di una mia convinzione, e cioè che tutti insieme, con la giusta dose di concretezza, scienza, serietà, siamo ancora in grado di fare qualcosa e di scrivere un nuovo epilogo. Dipende solo da noi in questa stanza e da noi fuori da questa stanza. Voglio lasciarvi con una citazione particolarmente bella che ho sentito molto vicina nei giorni di Youth for Climate, ed è la seguente. Torneremo a casa, attraversando le strade della vita, incontrando i volti di un'umanità bisognosa d'amore. Calpesteremo una terra che chiede di essere rispettata e non sfruttata, amata e non violentata. Guarderemo il cielo con il sole splendere oltre le nubi per riaccendere la speranza. Scruteremo le stelle che solo nel buio siamo in grado di vedere. Grazie.
Grazie mille davvero per i vostri interventi. Si sono così conclusi i lavori della nostra riunione per la giornata odierna. Grazie a tutti.